Hi everybody, this is K.R. Morgan and welcome back to my channel. Last video, I did a review of the Captive Prince series by C.S. Pacat. Today, I wanted to do a reading from the first book in that series, so that way you can find out if you'd be interested in buying the books, or it might just be a relaxing video for you if you like the sound of people reading. So just a general disclaimer, obviously I didn't write any of this. This all belongs to C.S. Pacat, and you can buy her work at Amazon or anything like that. Also, the first chapter does talk quite a bit about slavery, so if that makes you uncomfortable, then I would recommend not watching this video. Captive Prince, Book 1 of the Captive Prince Trilogy by C.S. Pacat. Enjoy! Prologue. We hear that your prince, said Lady Jocaste, keeps his own harem. These slaves will please any traditionalist, but I have asked Adrastus to prepare something special in addition. A personal gift for your prince from the king, a gem in the rough, as it were. His Majesty has already been so generous, said Councillor Guillaume, ambassador of Vere. They strolled the length of the viewing gallery. Guillaume had dined on mouth-watering spiced meats wrapped in grape leaves, the noonday heat fanned away from his reclining form by attentive slaves. He felt generously willing to admit that this barbaric country had its charms. The food was rustic, but the slaves were impeccable, faultlessly obedient and trained to efface and anticipate. Nothing like the spoiled pets at the court of Vere. The gallery was decorated by 24 slaves on display. All were either naked or barely clad in transparent silks. Around their necks, the slaves wore gold collars decorated with rubies and tanzanite, and on their wrists, golden wrist cuffs. These were purely ornamental. The slaves knelt in demonstration of their willing submissiveness. They were to be a gift from the new king of Achielos to the regent of Vere, a highly generous gift. The gold alone was worth a small fortune, while the slaves were surely some of the finest in Achielos. Privately, Guillaume had already earmarked one of the palace slaves for his personal use, a demure youth with a beautifully slender waist and heavily lashed dark eyes. As they reached the far end of the gallery, Adrastus, the keeper of the royal slaves, bowed sharply, the heels of his laced brown leather boots drawing together. "Ah, here we are," said Lady Jocaste, smiling. They proceeded into an antechamber, and Guillaume's eyes widened. Bound and under heavy guard was a male slave unlike any Guillaume had ever seen. Powerfully muscled and physically imposing, he was not wearing the trinket chains that adorned the other slaves in the gallery. His restraints were real. His wrists were lashed behind his back, and his legs and torso were bound with thick cords. Despite this, the force of his body looked only barely contained. His dark eyes flashed furiously above the gag, and if you looked closely at the expensive cords that bound his torso and legs, you could see the red welts where he had fought hard against his restraints. Guillaume's pulse sped up, an almost panicked reaction. A gem in the rough? This slave was more like a wild animal. Nothing like the 24 tame kittens who lined the hall. Guillaume looked at Adrastus, who was hanging back, as though the slave's presence made him nervous. "Are all the new slaves bound?" asked Guillaume, trying to regain his composure. "No, just him. That is..." Adrastus hesitated. "Yes?" "He isn't used to being handled," said Adrastus, with an uneasy sideways look at Lady Jocaste. "He hasn't been trained." "The prince, we hear, enjoys a challenge," said Lady Jocaste. Guillaume tried to quell his reaction as he turned his gaze back to the slave. It was highly questionable whether this barbarous gift would appeal to the prince, whose feelings towards the savage inhabitants of Achielos lacked warmth, to say the least. "Does he have a name?" asked Guillaume. "Your prince is, of course, free to name him whatever he likes," said Jocaste. "But I believe it would greatly please the king if he were to call him Damon." Her eyes glittered. Lady Jocasta, said Andrastus, seemingly in objection, though of course that was impossible. Guion looked from one to the other of them. He saw that he was expected to make some comment. This is certainly an interesting choice of name, said Guion. In fact, he was appalled. The king thinks so, said Lady Jocasta, stretching her lips slightly. They killed his slave, Lycaios, with the quick slice of a sword across her throat. She was a palace slave, untrained in combat, and so sweetly obedient that, had he commanded it of her, she would have knelt and bared her own throat for the stroke. She was not given a chance to obey or resist. She folded soundlessly, her pale limbs lying quite still on the white marble. Beneath her, blood began slowly to spread out over the marble floor. "Seize him," said one of the soldiers who poured into the room, a man with lank brown hair. Damon might have allowed it simply out of shock, but it was in that instance that two of the soldiers lay hands on Lycaios and cut her down. At the end of the first exchange, 3 of the soldiers were dead, and Damon had possession of a sword. The men facing him wavered and held back. "Who sent you?" said Damon. The lank-haired soldier said, "The king." "Father?" He almost lowered his sword. "Castor, your father is dead. Take him." Fighting came naturally to Damon, whose abilities were born of strength, natural aptitude, and relentless practice. But these men had been sent against him by one who knew all of that very well, and further was not stinting in his judgment of how many soldiers it would take to overcome a man of Damon's caliber. Overwhelmed by numbers, Damon could only last so long before he was taken, his arms twisted behind his back, a sword at his throat. He had then naively expected to be killed. Instead, he was beaten, restrained, and, when he fought free, doing a gratifying amount of damage for one who had no weapon, beaten again. "Get him out of here," said the lank-haired soldier, wiping the back of his hand across the thin line of blood at his temple. He was thrown into a cell. His mind, which ran along straight and candid lines, could not make sense of what was happening. "Take me to see my brother," he demanded, and the soldiers laughed, and one kicked him in the stomach. "Your brother's the one who gave the order," one of them sneered. "You are lying. Castor's no traitor." But the door of his cell slammed shut, and doubt raised its head for the first time. He had been naive, a small voice began to whisper. He hadn't anticipated, he hadn't seen, or perhaps he had refused to see, giving no credence to the dark rumors that seemed to disrespect the honor with which a son should treat the final days of a sick and dying father. In the morning they came for him, and understanding now all that had occurred, and wishing to meet his captor with courage and bitter pride, he allowed his arms to be lashed behind his back, submitting to the rough handling and moving forward when he was propelled by a hard shove between the shoulders. When he realized where he was being taken, he began to struggle again, violently. The room was simply carved in white marble. The floor, also marble, sloped faintly, terminating at an unobtrusive carved runnel. From the ceiling hung a pair of shackles, to which Damon, forcefully resisting, was chained against his will, his arms pulled up above his head. These were the slave baths. Damon jerked against the restraints. They didn't budge. His wrists were already bruised. On this side of the water, a miscellany of cushions and towels were arranged in an appealing tumble. Colored glass bottles in a variety of shapes, containing a variety of oils, glimmered like jewels amid the cushions. The water was scented, milky, and decorated with slowly drowning rose petals. All the niceties. This could not be happening. Damon felt a surge in his chest, fury, outrage, and somewhere buried beneath these, a new emotion that twisted and roiled in his belly. One of the soldiers immobilized him in a practiced hold from behind. The other began to strip him. His garments were unpinned and drawn off swiftly. His sandals were cut from his feet. the burn of humiliation hot as steam across his cheeks. Damon stood shackled, naked, the moist warmth of the baths curling up against his skin. The soldiers withdrew to the archway, where a figure dismissed them, his chiseled face handsome and familiar. Adrastus was the keeper of the royal slaves. His was a prestigious position that had been bestowed upon him by King Theomedes. Damon was hit by a wave of anger so powerful it almost robbed him of his vision. When he came back to himself, he saw the way Adrastus was considering him. "You wouldn't dare lay a hand on me," said Damon. "I'm under orders," said Adrastus, though he was holding back. "I'll kill you," said Damon. "Maybe a woman," said Adrastus, backing up a step and whispering into the ear of one of the attendants, who bowed and left the room. A slave entered a few moments later. Hand-picked, she matched all that was known of Damon's tastes. Her skin was as white as the marble of the baths, and her yellow hair was simply pinned, exposing the elegant column of her throat. Her breasts were full and swelled beneath the gauze. Her pink nipples were faintly visible. Damon watched her approach with the same wariness with which he would follow the movements of an opponent on the field, though he was no stranger to being serviced by slaves. Her hand rose to the clasp at her shoulder. She exposed the curve of a breast, a slender waist, the gauze sliding down to her hips and lower. Her garments dropped to the floor. Then she picked up a water scoop. Naked, she bathed his body, soaping and rinsing, heedless of the way the water spilled against her own skin and splashed her round breasts. Finally, she wet and soaped his hair, washing it thoroughly, finishing by rising up on her toes and tipping one of the smaller tubs of warm water over the back of his head. Like a dog, he shook it off. He looked around for Adrastus, but the keeper of the slaves seemed to have disappeared. The slave took up one of the colored vials and poured some of its oil into her palm. Coating her hands, she began to work the stuff into his skin with methodical strokes, applying it everywhere. Her eyes remained downcast, even when her strokes deliberately slowed and she moved against him. Damon's fingers bit into his chains. "That's enough," said Jocasta, and the slave jerked back from Damon, prostrating herself on the wet marble floor instantly. Damon, manifestly aroused, weathered Jocasta's calmly appraising gaze. "I want to see my brother," said Damon. "You have no brother," said Jocasta. "You have no family. You have no name, rank, or position. By now, you should know that much at least." "Do you expect me to submit to this? To be mastered by who? Adrastus? I'll tear his throat out." "Yes, you would. But you won't be serving in the palace." "Where?" Flatly. She gazed at him. Damon said, "What have you done?" "Nothing," she said, "but choose between brothers." They had last spoken in her rooms in the palace. Her hand had pressed to his arm. She looked like a painting. Her blonde curls were coiled and perfect, and her high, smooth brow and classical features were composed. Where Adrastus had held back, her delicate sandals picked their way with calm and sure steps across the wet marble towards him. He said, "Why keep me alive? What need does this satisfy? It's need enough, except for that. Is it..." He bit down on it. She deliberately misunderstood his words. "A brother's love? You don't know him at all, do you? What's a death but easy, quick? It's supposed to haunt you forever, that the one time he beat you was the one time that mattered." Damon felt his face changing shape. "What?" She touched his jaw, unafraid. Her fingers were slender, white, and faultlessly elegant. "I see why you prefer pale skin," she said. "Yours hides the bruising." After they locked him into the gold collar and wrist cuffs, they painted his face. There was no taboo in Achielos regarding male nudity, but the paint was the mark of a slave. And it was mortifying. He thought there was no greater humiliation than when he was thrown to the ground in front of Adrastus. Then he saw Adrastus's face, saw the assurant expression. "You look..." Adrastus gazed at him. Damon's arms were bound behind his back, and further restraints had restricted his movements to little more than a hobble. Now he was sprawled on the ground at Adrastus's feet. He drew himself up onto his knees, but was prevented from rising further by the restraining grip of his two guards. "You did it for a position," said Damon, flat hatred in his voice. "You're a fool. You'll never advance. He can't trust you. You've already betrayed for gain once." The blow snapped his head to one side. Damon ran his tongue over the inside of his lip and tasted blood. "I did not give you permission to speak," said Adrastus. "You hit like a milk-fed catamite," said Damon. Adrastus took a step back, his face white. "Gag him," he said, and Damon was struggling again, in vain, against the guard. His jaw was expertly prized open, and a thickly cloth-bound iron bit forced into his mouth and swiftly tied. He could make no more than a muffled sound, but he glared at Adrastus over the gag with defiant eyes. "You don't understand it yet," said Adrastus, "but you will. You'll come to understand that what they are saying in the palace, in the taverns, and in the streets is true. You're a slave. You're worth nothing. Prince Damianos is dead." Chapter 1. Damon came back to himself in stages. His drugged limbs heavy against the silk cushions, the gold cuffs on his wrists like lead weights. His eyelids raised and lowered. The sounds he heard made no sense at first, the murmur of voices speaking Varetian. Instinct said, "Get up." He gathered himself, pushed up onto his knees. Varetian voices? His muddled thoughts, arriving at this conclusion, could make nothing of it at first. His mind was harder than his body to muster. He could not immediately remember anything after his capture, though he knew that time had passed between now and then. He was aware that at some point he had been drugged. He searched for that memory. Eventually, he found it. He had tried to escape. He had been transported inside a locked wagon under heavy guard to a house on the edge of the city. He had been pulled from the wagon into a closed courtyard, and he remembered bells. The courtyard had filled with the sudden sound of bells, a cacophony of sound from the highest places in the city, carrying in the warm evening air. Bells at dusk, heralding a new king. Theomedes is dead. All hail Castor. At the sound of the bells, the need to escape had overwhelmed any urge to caution or subterfuge, part of the fury and grief that came upon him in waves. The starting of the horses had given him his opportunity, but he had been unarmed and surrounded by soldiers in a closed courtyard. Subsequent handling had not been delicate. They had thrown him into a cell deep in the bowels of the house, after which they had drugged him. Days had bled into one another. Of the rest he recalled only brief snatches, including, his stomach sank, the slap and spray of salt water, transportation aboard a ship. His head was clearing. His head was clearing for the first time in how long? How long since his capture? How long since the bells had rung? How long had he allowed this to go on? A surge of will drove Damon from his knees onto his feet. He must protect his household, his people. He took a step. A chain rattled, the tiled floor slid under his feet. Dizzily, his vision swam. He struck out for support and steadied himself, one shoulder against the wall. With an effort of will, he did not slide back down it. Holding himself upright, he forced the dizziness back. Where was he? He made his hazy mind take inventory of himself and his surroundings. He was dressed in the brief garments of an Achaelan slave, and from head to toe he was clean. He supposed this meant he had been tended, though his mind could supply him with no memory of it happening. He retained the gold collar and the gold cuffs on his wrists. His collar was chained to an iron link in the floor by means of a chain and a lock. Thin hysteria threatened for a moment. He smelled faintly of roses. As for the room, everywhere he looked, his eyes were assaulted with ornamentation. The walls were overrun with decoration. The wooden doors were delicate as a screen and carved the repeated design that included gaps in the wood. Through them, you could glimpse shadowy impressions of what lay on the other side. The windows were similarly screened. Even the floor tiles were parti-colored, and arranged in a geometric pattern. Everything gave the impression of patterns within patterns, the twisty creations of the Varetian mind. It came together then, suddenly, Varetian voices, the humiliating presentation to Councillor Guillaume. Are all the new slaves bound? The ship, and its destination. This was Vir. Damon stared around himself in horror. He was in the heart of enemy territory, hundreds of miles from home. It didn't make sense. He was breathing without holes and had not suffered the regrettable accident he might have expected. The Varetian people had good reason to hate Prince Damianos of Achielos. Why was he still alive? The sound of the bolt being thrown back jerked his attention to the door. Two men strode into the room. Watching them warily, Damon indistinctly recognized the first as a Varetian handler from the ship. The second was a stranger, dark-haired, bearded, wearing Varetian clothing, with silver rings on each of the 3 joints of every finger. "This is the slave that is being presented to the prince?" said the ringed man. The handler nodded. "You say he's dangerous. What is he? A prisoner of war? A criminal?" The handler shrugged a "who knows." "Keep him chained." "Don't be foolish. We can't keep him chained forever." Damon could feel the ringed man's gaze lingering on him. The next words were almost admiring. "Look at him. Even the prince is going to have his hands full." "Aboard the ship, when he made trouble, he was drugged," said the handler. "I see." The man's gaze turned critical. "Gag him and shorten the chain for the prince's viewing. And arrange an appropriate escort. If he makes trouble, do whatever you have to." He spoke with dismissive words, as though Damon was of minimal importance to him, no more than a task on a checklist. It was dawning on Damon, through the clearing drug haze, that his captors did not know the identity of their slave. A prisoner of war, a criminal. He let out a careful breath. He must stay quiet, inconspicuous. Enough presence of mind had returned to him to know that as Prince Damianos, he would be unlikely to last a night alive in Vir. Better by far to be thought a nameless slave. He allowed the handling. He had judged the exits and the quality of the guards in his escort. The quality of the guards was less significant than the quality of the chain around his neck. His arms were lashed behind his back and he was gagged. The collar chain shortened to only 9 links, so that even kneeling, his head was bowed and he could barely look up. Guards took up position on either side of him, and on either side of the doors which he faced. He had time then to feel the expectant silence of the room and the tightening string of heartbeats in his chest. There was a sudden flurry of activity, voices and footsteps approaching. The prince's viewing. The regent of Vir held the throne for his nephew, the crown prince. Damon knew almost nothing about the prince except that he was the younger of 2 sons. The older brother and former heir, Damon well knew, was dead. The scattering of courtiers was entering the room. The courtiers were nondescript except for one, a young man with an astonishingly lovely face, the kind of face that would have earned a small fortune on the slave block in Achielos. Damon's attention caught and held. The young man had yellow hair, blue eyes, and very fair skin. The dark blue of his severe, hard-laced clothing was too harsh for his fair coloring, and stood in stark contrast to the overly ornate style of the rooms. Unlike the courtiers who trailed in his wake, he wore no jewelry, not even rings on his fingers. As he approached, Damon saw that the expression that sat on the lovely face was arrogant and unpleasant. Damon knew the type, self-absorbed and self-serving, raised to overestimate his own worth and indulge in petty tyrannies over others. Spoilt. "I hear the king of Achielos has sent me a gift," said the young man, who was Laurent, prince of Vir. An Achielon groveling on its knees. How fitting. Around him, Damon was aware of the attention of courtiers, gathered to witness the prince's receipt of his slave. Laurent had stopped dead the moment he had seen Damon, his face turning white, as though in reaction to a slap or an insult. Damon's view, half truncated by the short chain on his neck, had been enough to see that, but Laurent's expression had shuddered quickly. That he was only one of a larger consignment of slaves was something Damon had guessed, and the murmurs from the 2 courtiers nearest him confirmed it, gratingly. Lawrence's eyes were passing over him, as though viewing merchandise. Damon felt a muscle slide in his jaw. Counselor Guillaume spoke. He's intended as a pleasure slave, but he isn't trained. Castor suggested that you might like to break him at your leisure. I'm not desperate enough that I need to soil myself with filth, said Laurent. Yes, your highness. Break him on the cross. I believe that will discharge my obligation to the king of Achielos. Yes, your highness. He could feel the relief in Counselor Guillaume. Handlers were quickly motioned to take him away. Damon supposed that he had presented rather a challenge to diplomacy. Castor's gift blurred the line between munificent and appalling. The courtiers were making to leave. The mockery was over. He felt the handler bend to the iron link in the floor. They were going to unchain him and take him to the cross. He flexed his fingers, gathering himself, his eyes on the handler, his single opponent. Wait, said Laurent. The handler halted, straightening. Laurent came forward a few paces to stand in front of Damon, gazing down at him with an unreadable expression. I want to speak with him. Remove the gag. He's got a mouth on him, warned the handler. Your Highness, if I might suggest, began Counselor Guillaume. Do it. Damon ran his tongue around the inside of his mouth after their handler released the cloth. What's your name, sweetheart? Said Laurent, not quite pleasantly. He knew better than to answer any question posed in that saccharine voice. He lifted his eyes to Lawrence. That was a mistake. They gazed at each other. Perhaps he's defective, suggested Guillaume. Pellucid blue eyes rested on his. Laurent repeated the question slowly in the language of Achielos. The words came out before he could stop them. I speak your language better than you speak mine, sweetheart. His words, carrying only the barest trace of an Achielan accent, were intelligible to all, which earned him a hard blow from the handler. For good measure, a member of the escort pushed his face right down to the floor. The king of Achielos says, if it pleases you, call him Damon, said the handler, and Damon felt his stomach drop. There were a few shocked murmurs from the courtiers in the chamber. The atmosphere, already prurient, became electric. They thought a slave nicknamed for their late prince would amuse you. It's in poor taste. They are an uncultured society, said Counselor Guillaume. This time, Lauren's tone didn't change. I heard that the king of Achielos may marry his mistress, the Lady Jocaste. Is that true? There was no official announcement, but there was talk of the possibility, yes. So the country will be ruled by a bastard and a whore, said Laurent. How appropriate. Damon felt himself react, even restrained as he was, with the hard jerk aborted by chains. He caught the self-satisfied pleasure on Laurent's face. Laurent's words had been loud enough to carry to every courtier in the room. Shall we have him taken to the cross, your highness? Said the handler. No, said Laurent. Restrain him here in the harem, after you teach him some manners. The 2 men entrusted to the task went about it with methodical and matter-of-fact brutality. But they had a natural reluctance to damage Damon totally beyond repair, being that he was the prince's possession. Damon was aware of the ringed man issuing a series of instructions, then departing. Keep the slave restrained here in the harem, the prince's orders. No one is to come in or out of the room, the prince's orders. 2 guards at the door at all times, the prince's orders. Don't let him off the chain, the prince's orders. Though the 2 men lingered, it seemed that the blows had stopped. Damon pushed himself up slowly to his hands and knees. Gritty tenacity made something of the situation. His head, at least, was now perfectly clear. Worse than the beating had been the viewing. He had been more shaken by it than he would admit. If the collar chain had not been so short, so impossibly secure, he might have resisted, despite his earlier resolve. He knew the arrogance of this nation. He knew how the Varetians thought of his people. Barbarian. Slave. Damon had gathered all his good intentions about himself and endured it. But the prince, Lauren's particular blend of spoilt arrogance and petty spite, had been unbearable. "He doesn't look much like a pet," said the taller of the two men. "You heard, he's a bed slave from Achielos," said the other. "You think the prince fucks him?" skeptically. "More like the other way around." "Pretty sweet orders for a bed slave." The taller one's mind stuck on the subject as the other grunted noncommittally in reply. "Think what that'd be like, getting a leg over the prince." "I imagine it would be a lot like lying down with a poisonous snake," thought Damon. But he kept the thought to himself. As soon as the men left, Damon reviewed his situation. Getting free was not yet possible. His hands were untied again, and the collar chain had been lengthened. But it was too thick to separate from the iron link in the floor. Nor could the collar be opened. It was gold, technically a soft metal, but it was also too thick to manipulate, a constant heavy weight around his neck. It struck him how ridiculous it was to collar a slave with gold. The gold wrist cuffs were even more foolish. They would be a weapon in a close fight and currency on the journey back to Achielos. If he stayed alert while pretending to compliance, opportunity would follow. There was enough length in the chain to allow him perhaps 3 steps of movement in every direction. There was a wooden carafe of water well within reach. He would be able to lie comfortably on the cushions and even relieve himself in a gilt copper pot. He had not been drugged or bludgeoned all the way to unconsciousness as had happened in Achielos. Only 2 guards at the door, an unbolted window. Freedom was attainable, if not now, then soon. It must be soon. Time was not on his side. The longer he was kept here, the longer Castor would have to cement his rule. It was unbearable not to know what was happening in his country, to his supporters, and to his people. And there was another problem. No one had recognized him, but that didn't mean he was safe from discovery. Achielos and Vir had few dealings since the decisive battle at Marlis 6 years ago, but somewhere in Vir there would surely be a person or two who knew his face, having visited the city. Castor had sent him to the one place where he could expect to be treated worse as a prince than as a slave. Elsewhere, one of his captors, learning his identity, might be convinced to help him, either out of sympathy for his situation or for the promise of a reward from Damon's supporters in Achielos. Not in Vir. In Vir, he couldn't risk it. He remembered the words of his father on the eve of the battle at Marlis, warning him to fight, never to trust, because a Varetian would not keep his word. His father had been proven right that day on the battlefield. He would not think of his father. It would be best to be well rested. With that in mind, he drank water from the carafe, watching the last of the afternoon light slowly drain from the room. When it was dark, he lay his body, with all his aches, down on the cushions, and eventually he slept. And woke. Dragged up, a hand on his collar chain until he was on his feet, flanked by 2 of the faceless, interchangeable guards. The room was flaring into brightness as a servant lit torches and placed them in the wall brackets. The room was not overlarge, and the flickering of the torches transformed its intricate designs into a continuously moving, sinuous play of shape and light. In the center of this activity, regarding him with cool blue eyes, was Laurent. Laurent's severe dark clothing fitted him repressively, covering him from toe to neck, long sleeved to his wrists, with no openings that weren't done up with a series of tight, intricate ties that looked like they would take about an hour to loosen. The warm light of the torches did nothing to soften the effect. Damon saw nothing that did not confirm his earlier opinion, spoilt, like fruit too long on the vine. Laurent's slightly lidded eyes, the slackness around his mouth, spoke of a night wasted in a dissolute courtier's overindulgence in wine. "I've been thinking about what to do with you," said Laurent. "Break you on a flogging post? Or maybe use you the way Castor intended you to be used. I think that would please me a great deal." Laurent came forward, until he stood just 4 paces away. It was a carefully chosen distance. Damon judged that if he strained the chain to its limit, pulling its taut, they would almost, but not quite, touch. Nothing to say? Don't tell me you're shy now that you and I are alone. Lawrence's silken tone was neither reassuring nor pleasant. I thought you wouldn't soil yourself with a barbarian, said Damon, careful to keep his voice neutral. He was aware of the beat of his heart. I wouldn't, said Laurent. But if I gave you to one of the guards, I might lower myself as far as watching. Damon felt himself recoil, couldn't keep the reaction off his face. You don't like that idea? Said Laurent. Maybe I can think of a better one. Come here. Distrust and dislike of Laurent roiled within him, but Damon recalled his situation. In Akielos, he had thrown himself against the restraints, and they had grown even tighter as a result. Here, he was just a slave, and a chance to escape would come if he did not ruin it with hot-headed pride. He can endure Laurent's juvenile pinprick sadism. Laurent must get back to Akielos, and that meant that, for now, he must do as he was told. He took a wary step forward. No, said Laurent with satisfaction. Crawl. Crawl. It was as though everything ground to a halt in the face of that single order. The part of Damon's mind that told him he must feign obedience was drowned out by his pride. But Damon's reaction of scornful belief only had time to register on his face for a split second before he was sent sprawling onto his hands and knees by the guards. After a wordless signal from Laurent, in the next moment, again responding to a signal from Laurent, one of the guards drove his fist into Damon's jaw. Once, then again, and again. His head rang. Blood from his mouth dripped onto the tile. He stared at it, forcing himself with an effort of will not to react. Take it. Opportunity would come later. He tested his jaw, not broken. You were insolent this afternoon, too. That is a habit that can be cured. With a horsewhip. Laurent's gaze tracked over Damon's body. Damon's garments had loosened under the rough hands of the guards, bearing his torso. You have a scar. He had two, but the one that was now visible lay just below his left collarbone. Damon felt for the first time the stir of real danger, the flicker of his own quickening pulse. I served in the army. It wasn't a lie. So Castor sends a common soldier to rut with the prince. Is that it? Damon chose his words carefully, wishing he had his half-brother's facility for falsehood. Castor wished to humiliate me. I suppose I angered him. If he had another purpose in sending me here, I don't know what it is. The bastard king disposes of his waste by tossing it at my feet. Is that supposed to appease me? Said Laurent. Would anything? Said a voice behind him. Laurent turned. You find fault in so much lately. Uncle, said Laurent, I didn't hear you come in. Uncle? Damon experienced his second shock of the night. If Laurent addressed him as uncle, this man whose imposing shape filled the doorway was the regent. There was no physical resemblance between the regent and his nephew. The regent was a commanding man in his 40s, bulky, with heavy shoulders. His hair and beard were dark brown, without even the highlights to suggest that a blonde of Laurent's fair coloring could have sprung from the same branch of the family tree. The regent looked Damon briefly up and down. The slave appears to have self-inflicted bruising. He's mine. I can do with him what I like. Not if you intend having him beaten to death. That's not a suitable use for the gift of King Castor. We have a treaty with Akielos, and I won't see it jeopardized by petty prejudice. Petty prejudice, said Laurent. I expect you to respect our allies and the treaty, as do we all. I suppose the treaty says that I am to play pet with the dregs of the Akielon army? Don't be childish. Bed who you like, but value the gift of King Castor. You have already shirked your duty on the border. You will not avoid your responsibilities at court. Find some appropriate use for the slave. That is my order, and I expect you to obey it. It seemed for a moment as if Laurent would rebel, but he bit down on the reaction and said only, Yes, uncle. Now, come. Let us put this matter behind us. Thankfully, I was informed of your activities before they progressed far enough to cause some serious inconvenience. Yes, how lucky that you were informed. I would hate to inconvenience you, uncle. This was said smoothly, but there was something behind the words. The regent answered in a similar tone. I'm glad we are in accord. Their departure should have been a relief. So should the regent's intervention with his nephew. But Damon recalled the look in Lauren's blue eyes, and though left alone with the remainder of the night to rest undisturbed, he could not have said whether the regent's mercy had improved his situation or worsened it. All right, so that was the prologue and the first chapter of Captive Prince by C.S. Pacat. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed listening to me reading. I'm not the best at reading out loud, but I tried as hard as I could, so I hope you enjoyed it. My next video will be a review of a different book in a very similar genre, and that should be up in about 2 weeks, so keep an eye out for that. Keep reading and keep loving. Bye.